Tako, dobrodošli nazaj. Se bomo kar pošvicarsko držali naše ure. Vsaka minuta je dragocena. Lepo pozdravljeni torej v drugem delu
welcome to the second part
of
the green transformation of society, the future of adult training. So I'm Patricia Virtic, I come from Platforma Sloga, and together with the Slovenian Institute for Adult Education, we have organized this conference, and I look forward to meeting different people and coming across different projects. So there, when we are faced with challenges, we often forget that the solutions are there too. There are many promises on the paper. What about practice? The first speaker in the second session will talk about the connections between lifelong learning, sustainable development challenges, green transformation of the society. And he is this is Chris Millora, author of the project Bridge 47, and we have heard something about Chris today. Chris Millora comes from the Philippines. He is a researcher who has recently received his PhD on learning on social transformation in East Anglia in the UK. His research interests focused on the training of young and adult, and he has sent a message to me during the night and mentioned the typhoon in Philippines, and he actually recorded his contribution at the home of his friend, and let's listen to him.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you're joining us from. Thank you very much to our friends at Sloga for inviting me today for this very important and also very timely event. I had wanted to join you live online, but unfortunately, there is currently a typhoon, a strong typhoon that is hitting the north of the Philippines. And the area where I currently live, I'm currently based in the Philippines. So the area where I currently live in central Philippines, this is not the center of the typhoon, but we are experiencing very strong winds today and might run the risk of internet and power interruptions. So I did not want to risk it. So I decided to just record my presentation rather than not being able to present it all. But I think the situation where I am today, it's quite representative, I think, of one of the many issues in living in a country like the Philippines because of climate change, the kind of issues that we face because of climate change. While though most of the world's carbon footprint is concentrated in more developed nations, countries like the Philippines are bearing the brunt of the climate emergency. So for example, on average, my country experiences about 20 tropical cyclones every single year. And we are located in what is called the Pacific Ring of Fire, where we experience earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, etc. So these natural disasters, as they call it, means lives lost, schools closed, sources of livelihoods damaged for many families. And in the education sector, this meant that schools are being converted into evacuation centers, and teachers and students are being forced to brave strong floods and strong winds just to get to school, or even to cancel school altogether. So the Philippines, of course, is just a microcosm of how the world is literally on fire at the moment and could also be underwater. Many communities around the world are under extreme weather conditions or climate change conditions, and this has not stopped because of the global pandemic. In fact, the world is battling both this acute health crisis that the pandemic that we've been dealing with for the past couple of years, but also this more long-term issue of the climate emergency. And for me, for the education sector, and lifelong learning advocates who are, with us here in the Zoom room today, this meant the need to look into not only how climate change is impacting education, but also how education, and specifically adult education, and lifelong learning can be an agent of change in responding to the climate emergency. So let me just share my screen now, just to show you my intervention for today. So really, my intervention for today looks at lifelong learning and environmental education from a global perspective. So my intervention today focuses on that very idea. How can lifelong learning, particularly approaches to environmental education and literacy among adults, can enable us to shape a greener but also a much more safer future? And to do that, I'll be drawing from case study examples of programs in Canada, Indonesia, Botswana, and Siberia. But first, let's talk about lifelong learning. Now, there are two definitions here of lifelong learning on the screen today. The first one is lifelong learning is all learning activity undertaken throughout life with the aim of improving knowledge, skills, and competences within a personal, civic, social, and/or employment-related perspective. What is interesting in this European Commission definition is that it has very strong focus on knowledge and skills, right? That we are always being upskilled as individuals throughout life. However, what this definition also tells us that learning does not only happen in schools, it could happen all throughout life and all across different spaces. So we can learn not only in school,
v kontekst podpornega učenja, ki temelji na realnih situacijah, odprtih in
their households. And I think environmental education is the same. It's not only educating people within the classroom, especially adults who are not able to access education opportunities, but also being able to look for different learning opportunities across different spaces in life. However, I'd like to offer another definition here by Fisher. And I think what Fisher tries to encourage us is to look at lifelong learning at a much more wider perspective. Fisher says lifelong learning includes training approaches, but also transcends them by supporting learning in the context of realistic, open-ended, and ill-defined problems. So for Fisher, it's not only about learning the skills for the job market, it's also about learning to be able to work together, right? Learning to be more aware of the social issues like the climate change that people are facing and how are we going to address them. So this increased awareness, critical awareness, but also this ability to work with other people is also another important aspect of lifelong learning. And that really leads me to the links between lifelong learning and the climate emergency. Environmental education could happen significantly in informal and non-formal spaces, as I've said earlier. But there's this issue that a lot of environmental education programs have often been targeted towards children and young people, which I think is a little bit a missed opportunity. And I will talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. But lifelong learning in the context of the climate emergency also encourages people to draw from indigenous and local knowledge and practices towards environmental resilience. Remember that lifelong learning, we all know this, lifelong learning encourages us to look at different forms of knowledge that the school and the formal institutions or the university is not the only source of knowledge. There are so many other spaces, and included in that are indigenous people's knowledge, particularly within environmental resilience. But why do we need to engage adults in environmental literacy? These are some of the reasons. First, I think in the most important, and I would like to focus on this a little bit, is the idea of intergenerational learning. That it's really important that in attacking the climate emergency and being able to solve it, we need to think about not only children learning or young people learning, but also adults learning, because everyone has to have their share in terms of, in environmental instigating environmental change, but also it is about us learning from each other, or different generations learning from each other. What, for example, the Fridays for the Future has encouraged us to do is to make people accountable, yeah, to make adults accountable, young people making adults accountable for their actions, like in the third point here below. Adults must change if the environmental education of children is to have credibility, right? So it's not only all the time that the children are learning from adults that we need to teach them. Actually, we are learning so much from them and from their activism and from their passion in this particular area. So it's for environmental literacy and for environmental education, it's really about bringing as many people together in this particular fight. Now, let me go through some of the interesting examples around the world that perhaps we can learn from in terms of being able to respond to the climate crisis. The first case study that I found to be interesting is the Intergenerational Landed Learning Program that is being conducted in British Columbia in Canada. What they do is they actually bring together a group of students and a group of community elders who are retired farmers to explore the values of environmental concern and care for the land and engage in an intergenerational learning process. So here we are seeing intergenerational learning in action. We are seeing how outside school, this is in a garden setting, environmental setting, young people are learning from retired farmers on how to grow plants, etc. But also the retired farmers are learning from these kids on new technologies, different ways and of engaging in different forms or different channels of communication. It promotes garden-based intergenerational collaboration and hands-on learning. To teach about and promote environmental stewardship, healthy diets, lifestyle, and development. What is interesting about this program is, adults are learning and the kids are learning from adults, vice versa, but they also foster a better collaboration and very important collaboration between different stakeholders in the society, right? It involves a broad spectrum of organizations that influence environmental education and action messages across different parts of the city. So this is a very good example of what we can do if many different generations are working together towards the climate, towards understanding the environment and to become better actors towards the environment. Now, that's Canada. And now let's move on over to Southeast Asia and Indonesia. So this is the case study of the Jayagiri Center in Indonesia, which is actually a winner of the UNESCO Japan Prize. It's a laureate for this prize by UNESCO on education for sustainable development, because it's a very good example of the problem-solving power of education for sustainable development, which has not only reduced the number of school dropouts for children, but also solving social, economic, and environmental problems of rural residents and the urban poor through its support of smaller organizations. So what they actually did is they built a center which was open to young people, but also adults, free of charge. And in this particular organization, the learners come from small farming communities who made the living planting vegetables, but the land on the land owned by a state company near the village. So when the government imposed a ban on horticultural farming in the foothills to prevent the landslides, which occurred during monsoon season, then all these families suddenly lost their livelihoods. So what this particular program does is it provides training programs, especially available for women and young people, and it has led to more sustainable businesses. And they were able to produce an institution for early childhood and non-formal and informal education under the Ministry of National Education and Culture of Indonesia, right? So, and until today, the project is still ongoing. So the families that are part of this program are now able to earn 2 to 3 million Indonesian rupiah, around 140 to 210 euros per month, which is about twice the minimum age of workers in Banda, Indonesia. So it offers a lot of benefits across different stakeholders, this particular program. It was about saving the environment, the sustainable farming and horticulture, using education and lifelong learning as a key approach, but it also leads to better livelihoods and bettering the lives of women and community members in the area. This one, the case study from Botswana, describes a collaborative effort to integrate environmental and sustainability education into teacher education at the college experiencing water scarcity. So this is particularly in Molipololi College of Education in Botswana. So what they did actually is that they were able to establish a site for teaching natural and social sciences to student teachers. So they developed this area where they can teach student teachers, so those who are becoming teachers, about natural environment by being in the actual environment itself. It's also a multidisciplinary and teaching and learning resources. There is an on-site wetland and rainwater, greywater harvesting systems, indigenous trees, shrubs, and plants that were all installed and supported by water conservation measures, while serving as resources for, to support teaching, learning, and research among student teachers. So what this project is actually doing is it's trying to develop the next generation of teachers. Again, a very different perspective in lifelong learning by engaging them in environmental education, by being more hands-on rather than just teaching them from books or inside the classroom. What is very interesting about this particular project is it was able to establish this new teaching and learning research opportunities. The student teachers were empowered by these opportunities to plan, implement, and monitor their own projects within this particular organization or particular space. So it was a very consultative approach, right? And offering assistance, which were valuable in initiating the project. So again, this is another approach of doing environmental education outside schooling. And the final example that I have is an environmental education fund, Uvas Mitut, or in English, it means home of the northern people in Siberia. So this is an environmental education program at an ethnic camp, which enables visitors to become familiar with the ecological wisdom of the indigenous peoples of Western Siberia, of Russia. This program illustrates how indigenous communities can participate in the global agenda as actors, suggesting their responses to global environmental challenges. What is very interesting here is you're exposing people, visitors, and the local community into an environmental program, an environmental learning program that is very much tightly linked with the indigenous practices of these indigenous peoples. So developing a responsible attitude towards nature and social cultural objects can be done, or it's being done in this particular organization, a particular approach. So it was about developing learning activities. So it's developing better attitudes through learning activities about the traditional way of life and the use of natural resources of indigenous peoples in this particular community. They created this camp in 2017, and what it does is it demonstrates the importance of human-nature relationship for the indigenous peoples of the North. It emphasizes the role of animals, of plants, of landscape, of climate, and the natural phenomenon in the mindset and economic life of the local community, the Kanti, Mansi, and Nenets. And it's also about familiarizing the visitors with nature-aligned technologies of the indigenous people of the North. So what they're doing here is that they're taking wisdom from indigenous peoples and using that wisdom and providing a learning opportunity for people to learn from this wisdom and perhaps apply it in their own contexts, right? So it's very important for these social interactions to happen in these different spaces. And that, I think, is the strength of this particular program. So what are we learning from all these case studies from around the world? And I think these are some of the policy recommendations that I'd like to present today. but also this is coming from the research that I've done from Bridge 47, which I think Riley has explained earlier in the day. I had the opportunity to conduct research for them, and these are some of the policy recommendations that we were looking at. And this is also coming from the learning from the case studies. The first thing is that environmental education policies should acknowledge that learning occurs in all stages of life in various forms and spaces. So it's not only learning in schools, it's also learning in indigenous communities, such as in Siberia. It's also learning in gardens, such as in the case studies in Canada, in horticulture, such as in Indonesia. Number two, policymakers need to ensure that lifelong learning and transformative education is made a priority at the national, regional, and global levels. There has to be a policy support for these particular programs to be able to have an enabling environment for them to be able to achieve their goals. So it's not only about supporting them through resources, but also having the policy framework within which they could contribute towards. And lifelong learning could be positioned as a policy approach to education that cuts across and brings together various SDGs. And this is what we're learning, right? It's not only about environmental education per se, it's not only about quality education per se, it's also about the care of land, one of the SDGs. It's also about gender empowerment or gender equality, such as in the case study of Indonesia. It is also about quality education, such as in the case study of Botswana, right? We're developing student teachers. It's about the SDG on partnership, which is very important across all of the case studies. Some people say that lifelong learning and adult learning actually is the invisible glue that holds the SDGs together. And finally, it's very important that we think of marginalized communities not only as recipients of lifelong learning programs or in environmental learning programs, but as stakeholders that could help shape these policies. What can we learn from the experiences of indigenous peoples, of women, of older people? How can we learn from them instead of just thinking of them as recipients of our learning programs? What can we learn from them so we can develop more responsive programs? Okay, so I think I'll leave it here. And as you can probably see, it's a very complex issue, climate change. But I think when we work together and we do not leave adults behind, right, then we can have this very intergenerational approach to responding to climate change crisis, unlocking the power of education in the process. Again, thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm sorry I can't be with you live, but many greetings from the Philippines, and hope you have a good rest of the conference. Thank you very much.
We came back to Slovenia. We are sending good wishes to the other side of the world, and thank you, Chris, for your words that have encouraged some new ideas, some new thought.